History of Rock Music in 500 Songs by Andrew Hickey.
Episode 47, Goodnight My Love by Jesse Belvin. Before we begin, a quick content warning. This episode contains material dealing with the immediate aftermath of a death in a car crash. While I am not explicit, this might be upsetting for some. Jesse Belvin is a name that not many people recognise these days. He's a footnote in the biographies of people like Sam Cooke or the Penguins, someone whose contribution to music history is usually summed up in a line or two in a book about someone else. The problem is that Jesse Belvin was simply too good and too prolific to have a normal career. He put out a truly astonishing number of records as a songwriter, performer, and group leader, under so many different names that it's impossible to figure out the true extent of his career. And people like that don't end up having scholarly books written about them. And when you do find something that actually talks about Belvin himself, you find wild inaccuracies. For example, in researching this episode, I found over and again that people claimed that Barry White played piano on the song we're looking at today, Goodnight My Love. Now, White lived in the same neighbourhood as Belvin, and they attended the same school, so on the face of it, that seems plausible. It seems plausible, at least, until you realise that Barry White was 11 when Goodnight My Love came out. Even so, on the off chance, I tracked down an interview with White, where he confirmed that no, he was not playing piano on doo-wop classics before he hit puberty. But that kind of misinformation is all over everything to do with Jesse Belvin. The end result of this is that Jesse Belvin is someone who exists in the gaps of other people's histories, and this episode is an attempt to create a picture out of what you find when looking at the stories of other musicians. As a result, it will almost certainly be less accurate than some other episodes. There's so little information about Belvin that if you didn't know anything about him, you'd assume he was some unimportant, minor figure. But in 1950s R&B, among musicians, especially those on the West Coast, there was no bigger name than Jesse Belvin. He had the potential to be bigger than anyone, and he would have been had he lived. He was Stevie Wonder's favourite singer of all time, and Etta James argued to her dying day that it was a travesty that she was in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame while he wasn't. Sam Cooke explicitly tried to model his career after Belvin, to the extent that after Cooke's death, his widow kept all of Cooke's records separate from her other albums, except Belvin's, which she kept with Cooke's. Marv Goldberg, who is by far the preeminent expert on 40s and 50s black vocal group music, refers to Belvin as the genre's most revered stylist, and at the time he died, he was on the verge of finally becoming as well known as he deserved to be. So let's talk about the life and the tragic death of Mr. Easy himself.
Good night, my love, pleasant dreams and sleep tight, my love. May tomorrow be sunny and bright and bring you closer to me.
Like so many greats of R&B and jazz, Belvin had attended Jefferson High School and studied music under the great teacher Samuel Brown, who is one of the great unsung heroes of rock and roll music. One of the other people that Brown had taught was the great rhythm and blues saxophone player Big J McNeely. McNeely was one of the all-time great saxophone hunkers, inspired mostly by Illinois Jacquet, and he had become the lead tenor saxophone player with Johnny Otis's band at the Barrel House Club, and played on records like Otis's Barrel House Stomp. As with many of the musicians Otis worked with, McNeely soon went on to a solo career of his own, and he formed a vocal group, 3 Dots and a Dash. 3 Dots and a Dash backed McNeely's saxophone on a number of records, and McNeely invited Belvin to join them as lead singer. Belvin's first recording with the group was on All That Wine Is Gone, an answer record to Drinking Wine Spodiodi.
I have to leave you, Daddy, 'cause the wine's all gone. All that wine is gone. Oh, elderberry. All that wine is gone. The cherry. All that wine is gone. Well, baby, all that wine is gone. Lord, berry. But cherry.
After recording 2 singles with McNeely, Belvin went off to make his own records, signing to Specialty Records. His first solo single, Baby Don't Go, was not especially successful, so he teamed up with the songwriter Marvin Phillips in a duo called Jesse and Marvin. The two of them had a hit with the song Dream Girl.
Dream girl, dream girl, I love you so. Dream girl, dream girl, I love you so. I you're dear that I adore.
Dream Girl went to number 2 on the R&B charts, and it looked like Jesse and Marvin were about to have a massive career. But shortly afterwards, Belvin was drafted. It was while he was in the armed forces that Earth Angel became a hit, a song he co-wrote and which we discussed in a previous episode, which I'll link in the show notes. Like many of the songs Belvin wrote, he ended up not getting credit for that one. But unlike most of the others, he went to court over it and got some royalties in the end. Marvin decided to continue the duo without Jesse, renaming it Marvin and Johnny, and moved over to Modern Records. But he didn't stick with a single Johnny. Instead, Johnny would be whoever was around, sometimes Marvin himself, double-tracked. He had several minor hit singles as Marvin and Johnny, including Cherry Pie, on which the role of Johnny was played by Emery Perry. Cherry Pie was a massive hit, but none of Marvin and Johnny's other records matched its success. However, on some of the follow-ups, Jesse Belvin returned as one of the Johnnies, notably on a cover version of Kokomo, which didn't manage to outsell either the original or Perry Como's version.
Talk to me, baby. Whisper in my ear. Talk to me, baby. Whisper in my ear. Come a little closer. Don't have no fear. Don't you know I love you so? Don't you know I love you so? When I hey, oh, come on.
Meanwhile, His time in the armed forces had set Belvin's career back, and when he came out, he started recording for every label and under every band name he could. Most of the time, he would also be writing the songs, but he didn't get label credit on most of them, because he would just sell all his rights to the songs for $100. Why not? There was always another song. As well as recording as Marvin and Johnny for Modern Records, he also sang with the Californians on Federal. The Shakes, also on Federal.
Well, girl, you're so fine, so fine, so fine, so fine. My baby so doggone fine. She loves me, come rain, come shine.
The Gassers on Cash.
Well, hummity dum, well, hummity dum, dear one, you're so divine, and I'm so glad that you are mine. You're the one I adore. I'll never, never, ever let you go.
As well as recording under his own name on both Specialty and on John Dolphin's Hollywood Records. But his big project at the time was the Cliques, a duo he formed with Eugene Church, who recorded for Modern. Their track, The Girl in My Dreams, was the closest thing he'd had to a big success since the similarly named Dream Girl several years earlier.
Girl of my dreams, where are you? Girl of my dreams, I'm so glued up to how I yearn, how I long for you.
That went to number 45 on the pop chart. Not a massive hit, but a clear commercial success. And so, of course, at this point, Belvin ditched the Cliques name, rather than follow up on the minor hit, and started making records as a solo artist instead. He signed to Modern Records as a solo artist, and went into the studio to record a new song. Now, I am going to be careful how I phrase this, because John Mariscalco, who is credited as the co-writer of Goodnight My Love, is still alive. And I want to stress that Mariscalco is, by all accounts, an actual songwriter who has written songs for people like Little Richard and Harry Nilsson. But there have also been accusations that at least some of his songwriting credits were not deserved. In particular, the song Bertha Lou by Johnny Fair. Johnny Fair, whose real name was Donnie Brooks, recorded that with the Burnett brothers, and always said that the song was written not by Mariscalco, but by Johnny Burnett, who sold his rights to the song to Mariscalco for $50. Burnett's son Rocky backs up the claim. Now, in the case of Goodnight My Love, the credited writers are George Mottola and Mariscalco, but the story as it's normally told goes as follows. Mottola had written the bulk of the song several years earlier, but had never completed it. He brought it into the studio, and Jesse Belvin came up with the bridge. But he said that rather than take credit, he just wanted Mottola to give him $400. Mottola didn't have $400 on him, but Maniscalco, who was also at the session and is the credited producer, said he could get it for Belvin, and took the credit himself. That's the story, and it would fit with both the rumour that Maniscalco had bought an entire song from Johnny Burnett, and with Belvin's cavalier attitude towards credit. On the other hand, Maniscalco was also apparently particularly good at rewriting and finishing other people's half-finished songs, and so it's entirely plausible that he could have done the finishing up job himself. Either way, the finished song became one of the most well-known songs of the 50s.
You should awake in the still of night. Please have no fears, for I'll be there. You know I care. Please give your love to me, dear, only. Good night, my love. Pleasant dreams. Sleep tight.
Belvin's version of the song went to number 7 in the R&B charts, but its impact went beyond its immediate chart success. Alan Freed started to use the song as the outro music for his radio show, making it familiar to an entire generation of American music lovers. The result was that the song became a standard, recorded by everyone from James Brown to Gloria Estefan, the Four Seasons to Harry Connick Jr. If John Maniscalco did buy Jesse Belvin's share of the songwriting, that was about the best $400 he could possibly have spent. Over the next year, Belvin recorded a host of other singles as a solo artist, none of which matched the level of success he'd seen with Goodnight My Love, but which are the artistic foundation on which his reputation now rests. The stylistic range of these records is quite astonishing, from Latin pop like Señorita to doo-wop novelty songs like My Satellite, a song whose melody owes something to Hound Dog, credited to Jesse Belvin and the Space Riders, and released to cash in on the space craze that had started with the launch of the Russian satellite Sputnik.
I left the moon, I put on speed. I got more power than I'll ever need. From Mars to Pluto is just a little hop. That is if you're riding in what I got. Whoa, whoa, satellite. You ain't never been on a real flight till you ride my satellite. Whoa.
That featured Alex Hodge of the Platters on backing vocals. Hodge's brother, Gaynell Hodge, who like Belvin would form groups at the drop of a hat, joined Jesse in yet another of the many groups he formed. The Saxons consisted of Belvin, Gaynell Hodge, Eugene Church, who had been in the cliques with Belvin, and another former Jefferson High student, Belvin's friend Johnny Guitar Watson. Watson would later become well known for his 70s Gangster of Love persona and funk records, but at this point he was mostly making hard electric blues records like 3 Hours Past Midnight.
But I just can't close my eyes. Well, I toss and tumble on my pillow, but I just can't close my eyes. If my baby don't come back pretty soon, yes, I just can't be satisfied.
But when he worked with Belvin and the Saxons and other groups, he recorded much more straightforward doo-wop and rock and roll, like this example, Is It True? The Saxons also recorded as the Capris, though with Alex Hodge rather than Gaynell in that lineup of the group. And just to annoy everyone who cares about this stuff, and drive us all into nervous breakdowns, there was another group, also called the Saxons, who also recorded as the Capris on the same label. At least one single actually came out with one of the groups on one side and the other on the other. Indeed, the side featuring our Saxons had previously been released as a Jesse Belvin solo record. Anyway, I hope in this first half of the story I've given some idea of just how many different groups Jesse Belvin recorded with and under how many different names, though I haven't listed even half of them. This is someone who seemed to form a new group every time he crossed the street, and make records with most of them, and a surprising number of them had become hits. And Goodnight My Love and Earth Angel had become the kind of monster perennial standard that most musicians dream of ever writing. And of course, Belvin had become the kind of musician that most record companies and publishers dream of finding. The kind who will happily make hit records and sell the rights for a handful of dollars. That was soon to change. Belvin was married. I haven't been able to find out exactly when he married, but his wife also became his songwriting partner and his manager, and in 1958 she seemed to finally take control of his career for him. But before she did, there was one last pickup group hit to make. Frankie Irvin had been Charles Brown's replacement in Johnny Moore's Three Blazers, and had also sung briefly with Johnny Otis and Preston Love. While with Brown's group, he developed a reputation for being able to perform novelty cash-in records. He'd made Dragnet Blues, which had resulted in a lawsuit from the makers of the TV show Dragnet, and he'd also done his Johnny Ace impression on Johnny Ace's Last Letter, a single that had been rush-released by the Blazers after Johnny Ace's death.
This is my letter, my last goodbye. I've lived in misery, too late to cry. Please forgive me, oh please forgive me, I'm doing wrong.
Irvin was looking for a solo career after leaving the Blazers, and he was put in touch with George Mottola, who had a suggestion for him. A white group from Texas called the Slades had recorded a track called You Cheated, which looked like it could possibly be a big hit, except that the label it was on wasn't willing to come to terms with some of the big distributors over how much they were charging per record.
You lied, you said that you loved me, you cheated, you lied, you said that you want me, oh, what can I do but just keep on loving you, love.
Mottola wanted to record a sound-alike version of the song, with Jesse Belvin as the lead singer, but Belvin had just signed a record contract with RCA, and didn't want to put out lead vocals on another label. Would Irvin like to put out the song as a solo record? Irvin hated the song. He didn't like doo-wop generally, and he thought the song was a particularly bad example of the genre. But a gig was a gig, and it'd be a solo record under his own name. Irvin agreed to do it, and Mottola got Jesse Belvin to put together a scratch vocal group for the session. Belvin found Johnny Guitar Watson and Tommy Buster Williams at a local ballroom, and got them to come along. And on the way to the session they ran into handsome Mel Williams, and pulled him in. They were just going to be the uncredited backing vocalists on a Frankie Irvin record, and didn't spend much time thinking about what was clearly a sound-alike cash-in. But when it came out, it was credited as The Shields, rather than Frankie Irvin.
You said that you loved me, you cheated, you lied, you said
That's Belvin singing that wonderful falsetto part. Frankie Irvine was naturally annoyed that he wasn't given the label credit for the record. The recording was made as an independent production, but leased to Dot Records, and somewhere along the line someone decided that it was better to have a generic group name rather than promote it as by a solo singer who might get ideas about wanting money. In a nice bit of irony, the Shields managed to reverse the normal course of the music industry. This time, a sound-alike record by a black group managed to outsell the original by a white group. You Cheated ended up making number 12 on the pop charts. A massive hit for an unknown doo-wop group at the time. Irvine started touring and making TV appearances as the Shields, backed by some random singers the record label had pulled together. The rest of the vocalists on the record had been people who were under contract to other labels, and so couldn't make TV appearances. But the original Shields members reunited for the follow-up single, Nature Boy, where they were joined by the members of the Turks, who were yet another group that Belvin was recording with, and who included both Hodge brothers. That, according to Irvine, also sold 1 million copies, but it was nothing like as successful as You Cheated. The record label were getting sick of Irvine wanting credit and royalties and other things they didn't like singers, especially black ones, asking for. So the third Shields record only featured Belvin out of the original lineup, and subsequent recordings didn't even feature him. But while Belvin had accidentally put together yet another million-selling group, he had also moved on to bigger things. His wife had now firmly taken control of his career, and they had a plan. Belvin had signed to a major label, RCA, the same label that Elvis Presley was on, and he was going to make a play for the big time. He could still keep making doo-wop records with Johnny Guitar Watson and Eugene Church and the Hodge brothers and whoever else, if he felt like it. But his solo career was going to be something else. He was going to go for the same market as Nat King Cole, and become a smooth ballad singer. He was going to be a huge star, and he actually got to record an album, Just Jesse Belvin. The first single off that album was Guess Who, a song written by his wife Joanne, based on a love letter she had written to him.
Guess who? Someone really cares. Guess who? Guess who?
That song made the top 40, hitting number 33 on the pop chart, and managed to reach number 7 on the R&B charts. More importantly, it gained Grammy nominations for both Best R&B Performance and Best Male Vocal Performance. He lost to Dinah Washington and Frank Sinatra, and it's not as if losing to Dinah Washington or Frank Sinatra would have been an embarrassment. But by the time he lost those Grammys, Jesse was already dead, and so was Joanne. And here we get into the murkiest part of the story. There are a lot of rumours floating around about Jesse Belvin's death, and a lot of misinformation is out there, and frankly, I've not been able to get to the bottom of exactly what happened. When someone you love dies young, especially if that someone is a public figure, there's a tendency to look for complex explanations, and there's also a tendency to exaggerate stories in the telling. That's just human nature. And in some cases, that tendency is exploited by people out to make money. And Jesse and Joanne Belvin were both black people who died in the Deep South, and so no real investigation was ever carried out. That means that by now, with almost everyone who was involved dead, it's impossible to tell what really happened. Almost every single sentence of what follows may be false. It's my best guess as to the order of events and what happened, based on the limited information out there. On February the 6th, 1960, there was a concert in Little Rock, Arkansas, at the Robinson Auditorium. Billed as the first rock and roll show of 1960, the headliner was Jackie Wilson, a friend of Belvin's. Jesse had just recorded his second album, Mr. Easy, which would be coming out soon, and while he was still relatively low on the bill, he was a rising star. That album was the one that was going to consolidate Belvin's turn towards pop balladry in the Nat King Cole style, but it would end up being a posthumous release.
Told me when I was in knee pants, my mama done told me, son, well, a woman will sweet talk and give you the big eye, but when the sweet talk is done, a woman's a two-face, a wearisome thing who leave you to sing the blues.
It was an all-black lineup on stage, but according to some reports, it was an integrated audience. In fact, some reports go so far as to say it was the first integrated audience ever in Little Rock. Little Rock was not a place where the white people were fans of integration. In fact, they were so against it that the National Guard had had to be called in only 2 years earlier to protect black children when the first school in Little Rock had been integrated. And so, apparently, there was some racial abuse shouted by members of the audience. But it was nothing that the musicians hadn't dealt with before. After the show, they all drove on towards Dallas. Jackie Wilson had some car problems on the way, and got to the stop in Dallas later than he was expecting to. The Belvins hadn't arrived yet, and so Wilson called Jesse's mother in LA, asking if she'd heard from them. She hadn't. Shortly after setting off, the car with Jesse and Joanne in had been in a crash. Jesse and the drivers of both cars had been killed instantly. Kirk Davis, Belvin's guitarist on that tour, who had apparently been asleep in the back seat, was seriously injured but eventually came out of his coma, and Jesse had apparently reacted fast enough to shield his wife from the worst of the accident, but she was still unconscious and seriously injured. The survivors were rushed to the hospital, where, according to Etta James, who heard the story from Jackie Wilson, they refused to treat Joanne Belvin until they knew that they would get money. She remained untreated until someone got in touch with Wilson, who drove down from Dallas, Texas to Hope, Arkansas, where the hospital was, with the cash. But she died of her injuries a few days later. Now here's the thing. Within a fortnight of the accident, there were rumours circulating widely enough to have been picked up by the newspapers that Belvin's car had had its tyres slashed. There were also stories, never confirmed, that Belvin had received death threats before the show. And Jackie Wilson had also had car trouble that night, and according to some sources, so had at least one other musician on the bill. So, it's possible that the car was sabotaged. On the other hand, Belvin's driver, Charles Shackelford, had got the job with Belvin after being fired by Ray Charles. He was fired, according to Charles, because he kept staying awake watching the late-night shows, not getting enough sleep, and driving dangerously enough to scare Ray Charles, who was fearless enough that he used to ride motorbikes despite being totally blind. So when Jesse and Joanne Belvin died, they could have been the victims of a racist murder, or they could just have been horribly unlucky. But we'll never know for sure, because the institutional racism at the time meant that there was no investigation. When they died, they left behind 2 children under the age of 5, who were brought up by Jesse's mother. The oldest, Jesse Belvin Jr., became a singer himself, often performing material written or made famous by his father.
This is my tribute to my father, Jesse Belvin, the original Big Jesse, who wrote this song and made it a huge hit in 1957. Enjoy. Goodnight, my love, pleasant dreams and sleep tight, my love. May tomorrow be sun bright and bring you closer to me.
Jesse Jr. devoted his life to finding out what actually happened to his parents, but never found any answers. A History of Rock Music in 500 Songs is brought to you by the generosity of my backers on Patreon. Each week, Patreon backers will get a 10-minute bonus podcast. This week's is on In the Still of the Night by the 5 Satins. Visit patreon.com/Andrew Hickey to sign up for as little as $1 a month. This podcast is written, narrated and produced by me, Andrew Hickey. Visit 500songs.com, that's 500 the numbers, songs.com, to read transcripts and liner notes, and get links to hear the full versions of songs excerpted here. If you've enjoyed the show and feel it's worth reviewing, please do leave a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. But more importantly, tell just one person that you liked this episode. Word of mouth, more than any other form of promotion or reward, is how creative works get noticed and sustain themselves. Thank you very much for listening.